Hey there Ninja, I'm Stephanie Stiavetti from Fearless Fresh, and today we're going to talk about Penuche Fudge. Now, for those not in the know, Penuche Fudge is a fudge, obviously, but instead of being made with chocolate, like chocolate fudge, it's made with brown sugar and white sugar. So instead of tasting like chocolate, it tastes like caramel or butterscotch, like depending on how much brown sugar you add to it. So the recipe that I'm presenting you here is actually a perfectly balanced Penuche Fudge recipe that has like a perfect caramel flavor with a little bit of notes of butterscotch in it without being like too saccharine sweet. Because I really love Penuche Fudge, so it was really important to me to perfect my Penuche Fudge recipe so it was very well balanced. So in order to make fudge or any kind of candy, there's some stuff you need to know. Because candy is actually fairly easy to make, but there's some pitfalls you should be aware of to make sure that it turns out the way you want it to turn out. Now, when I first created this recipe, I made it and it turned out perfectly for me, and it turned out perfectly for all of my recipe testers, and it turned out perfectly for most of the people who made it off my website. But then every once in a while I would get a note from somebody who said that it wouldn't set, and so that they couldn't cut their fudge because it was just too thin and too runny. And so we did some experimenting and we figured out what the problem was. And the problem was that it wasn't being cooked long enough to a hot enough temperature. And for some people, they were working with candy thermometers that were inaccurate. And so their thermometer was wrong and they weren't cooking it to the wrong temperature, and therefore it didn't set. Now, when you're making candy, temperature is king. It's really important. And if you read the posts that I've written about temperatures, you're going to find a lot of really good information there. But suffice it to say that the hotter you take your sugar mixture, the harder it will be when it's done. And in a nutshell, the way it works is the longer you cook your sugar mixture, the more water evaporates, right? And the more water that evaporates, the more sugar is left behind. So the more water that leaves the mixture, the more concentrated the sugar becomes. So if you cook it for a little bit and you don't evaporate very much water out, it will actually be very thin. And when it cools off, it will not be hard. It'll be very runny. If you cook it for a really long time, more water will evaporate and it will become thicker while you're cooking it. And when it is completely cooled, it will be much more firm. So when we're making fudge, we would generally want to stick to like 237 to 242 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on your ideal texture. But I've changed the temperature on this particular recipe so that everybody can have success, right? So if you're in this window of like 237 to 242 Fahrenheit, you're going to have perfect fudge no matter what. So by increasing the temperature by a couple degrees, it turned out that everybody was able to make this fudge really successfully without any problems, and it turned out perfectly every single time. So it's really important that you have a candy thermometer that you can rely on, right? So if you had a candy thermometer sitting around the house for like 30 years, it might be time to get a new one. You can get a regular glass candy thermometer, or you can actually get a probe thermometer, which is a metal probe with a little digital display on it. And I find that those are really accurate, and those are what I personally cook with. Now, when it comes to working with sugar, you want to make sure you don't burn the sugar. This is really important, right? So you don't want to crank the heat and scorch the sugar, because if the sugar on the bottom of the pot burns, it'll make the whole thing taste like burnt sugar. And actually, some people really like the slightly bitter flavor of, somewhat burnt caramel. And if that's your thing, then totally go for it. I support that 100%. But a lot of people don't like that. They want kind of a pure caramel flavor, and they don't want it to taste burnt or bittered, in which case you want to make sure that you're scraping the bottom of the pot regularly to make sure nothing is burning. Then after you're done cooking your sugar mixture for your fudge, what you're going to do is you're going to put it in a mixer, and then you're going to whip it so that it gets beautifully thick, and then you're going to pour it into a prepared pan. You're going to let it sit for an hour, and you're going to cut it, and it's going to be perfect. So you may notice that there's two recipes on this page, and there's a reason for that, right? There's my original recipe, which is super easy. Basically, you just throw a bunch of stuff in a pot, you heat it, throw it into a mixer, you whip it, and then you throw it into a pan, and it sets. It's done. But I've also included a second recipe for people who are a little bit newer to candy making. And basically what we've done with the second recipe is implemented a stir and shock method. What this does is it basically hacks chemistry. So what you do is, instead of taking the hot sugar mixture and putting it right into a mixer, you take the hot sugar mixture and you put it in another bowl of ice water, and you allow it to cool around the outside. What that does is that causes the sugar around the outside of the caramel mixture, fudge mixture, to crystallize. And then when you whip it, what happens is those crystals that are already present seed the rest of the fudge mixture and allow it to set up even more easily. Now, both recipes work perfectly. But basically the difference between them two is the original recipe has fewer steps. Like I said, you basically just throw a bunch of stuff in a pot, then you beat it, and then you pour it into a pan and it's basically done. The second recipe has a couple extra steps, but it's a little bit more foolproof for beginners because, like I said, we've hacked chemistry. And so if you don't have a lot of a chemistry or candy experience, that second recipe for the stir and shock method is going to be the one to try. Now, somewhere on this page, you'll either find the recipe itself or a link to the recipe, which is hosted on fearlessfresh.com. And as always, Fearless Fresh is the place to go if you want to become a faster, more creative, more effective home cook. Have a good one.